Hello and welcome to the Stories That Brought You Here. It's the podcast dedicated to the stories of the people from Pender Island, British Columbia. I am your host, Chris Wakaluk, and I'll be sitting down in conversations with current Pender Island residents to hear the stories that brought them to this hippie little island we live on, and to also hear the stories that brought them to the point that they're at in their lives right now. Today, I will be speaking with Steve Wright. Now, if you know Steve like I know Steve, then you're going to know him as that guy who was a contractor on the island for many, many years. Well, we're going to get to hear Steve talk about his experiences with that, along with, you guessed it, many other things. We're going to get to hear Steve talk about what it was like growing up on Vancouver Island in a couple different communities there. He'll share stories about what it was like being a young boy and a teenager living on Vancouver Island. Steve will also talk about his experiences in his 20s, hitchhiking throughout different locations in North America. Steve will also talk about travel experiences he had in more recent years, which involved high elevation hiking and climbing trips. As well as Steve will also talk about how he's seen the island change in his 40 years while being on Pender Island. All that and a lot more in a pretty amazing interview I got to have with him. And, you know, I don't know if I say this all the time or too often, but I'm just so pleased to get a chance to do this because it really is so amazing to get to spend this time with people that I don't really know very well sometimes, and then to get to sit down and ask people questions and to hear some of the answers. Anyway, I was so blown away with a lot of the personal reflections and storytelling that Steve had in this, and I'm pretty sure you're going to dig it too. So anyway, that's it for that. We'll see you guys on the other side, and without further ado, here's my interview with Steve Wright. Okay, are you feeling ready to start?
Oh, sure.
All right, well, this is where I say welcome to the podcast.
Well, thanks.
Okay, well, here we are on a Wednesday afternoon. It's just after 1 o'clock. It's crazy windy out today.
'Tis that.
Indeed. You made your way here. You said that there was a fallen tree. Powers down certain parts of the island.
Yeah, it's we're getting into winter now. I feel more comfortable.
Really?
Knowing what's ahead of us.
Oh, okay. Yeah. All right. So
no surprises.
No surprises. This is the tester day for us. I'm looking out the window. I can see like a cedar tree blowing in the wind, and it's making me nervous. The power is going to go out. But anyway, actually, how was your morning so far?
Morning was good. I don't think I did very much at all. I'm sorting out through a bunch of stuff that I have left over from my folks' estate and my aunt's estate, so I'm just trying to clear out stuff and figure out where it's going to go and where I'm going to get rid of it all. So it's amazing that all the stuff that we collect is all junk if there's no emotional attachment to it. So I kind of pick up these pieces and I look at them and I say, well, this is just junk. Oh, but then my mom had that one, and suddenly it's not junk anymore. There's a connection to it. And then it's more difficult to sort of toss it aside. So try and find a good home for it. Somebody else can use it and appreciate it as much as she did.
What was the last thing that you chose to hang on to?
Actually, I don't hang on to very much, but because I'm trying to declutter. I have so much stuff after 40 years of living on Pender, and I brought so much of it with me that I still, unfortunately, still hang on to. But I'm trying to get rid of the bigger pieces. So I'm kind of, like yesterday we went through a bunch of crystal glasses. I was going to take them to New to You and see if anybody in the family wanted to hang on to them. And then I opened up a box and there was my father's Scotch glasses, beautiful old glasses with a decanter, the whole kit and caboodle. And it brought back a memory of me sitting down with my dad having a glass of Scotch on a regular basis. And so I decided that that's going nowhere.
Yeah, for sure. That's a good one to hang on to.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, yeah. All right. So it sounds like a bit of a thoughtful, emotional morning, a little bit, I guess.
Yeah. Just memories, good memories of my family.
Nice. Cool. All right. Yeah. Well, let's go from there to go to the first question that I get to on the podcast. And you mentioned 40 years on Pender Island. What brought you to Pender Island?
Well, we were in Victoria, and I decided then that I did not enjoy living in an urban setting. It was expensive. I didn't take advantage of many of the amenities and services that were there. I've always liked to be in a quieter place. I'm not a real huge fan of crowds or people. We're just looking for a quieter place to live, a place that I could afford to buy a piece of property and build a house. So we started looking at all the Gulf Islands. The woman I was with at the time, she had an uncle from California that lived on North Pender. So we came over to North Pender to look at it and drove around North Pender. And then on the way to the ferry, decided we'd take a turn to the right and head down across the bridge to South Pender. And I got to the end of Gallant Point Road and I just said, this is a place I want to live. And strangely enough, on the way to the ferry, we stopped in to see Mark Keating at Pender Realty. And she told me that there was no places to rent. There was nothing to do for someone my age. I didn't know that her son-in-law was the only contractor on the island. So I guess maybe she didn't want any competition there. But she gave us a fairly honest appraisal of the place and suggested that we look elsewhere. About a week after I was home, I got a call from a fella out in Canoe Bay or Canoe Cove by the ferry terminal to renovate his basement. And in my conversation with him about the job, they'd said they'd just come there. And strangely enough, they had a place, they just left South Pender. And they offered the place to me. And it was less than a kilometer away from the end of Gallant Point Road. And so when I completed that job, we moved over lock, stock, and barrel and lived in that place and started looking for property. Okay.
So when you said that you went to the end of Gallant Road on that first drive and then something tickled your imagination about it, to put words in your mouth, but what exactly was it about the place that really got you?
Those things are kind of undefinable. It's just a feeling you get. It was just the looking out across the water, just looking at the coastline. There weren't too many people there at that time. There weren't many houses, too many driveways. So it was a nice road all the way down there. I just liked the feel of it. I liked the sense of it. I can't describe it any more than that. It just felt good. So.
Okay.
That was the spot. That was the spot. I was home.
All right. Okay, so that's the spot. And then what happened in the first number of years where you're living on the South Island and deciding to live on Pender in the early 80s?
At that time, I was the youngest person living on South Pender. My wife and she had a 3-year-old son. And so we rented there for at least a year. And we met some of the older people that lived on South Pender, and they were of a huge help to a young family. They gave us good advice. They helped us. If we were in tough times, there was always somebody there to call and to help you out, welcomed you into their house, fed us, did everything to support us and convincing us that we should stay there. And then I met an elder lady, Vicky Gillespie, and she owned quite a bit of property down along the Craddock Drive, Southlands area. And after doing a number of jobs for her, she asked me if I'd like to buy one of her pieces of property. And back then you couldn't get a mortgage on any land on the Gulf Islands. And the only amount of money I had was what I'd brought over with me, which I think was around $20,000. And her lots were going for $69,000, $70,000 for 2 acres. So she brought the price down so that I could utilize my $20,000 as a deposit. And fortunately for me, my father was a teacher, and he organized a mortgage through the Teachers Co-op. So I got the extra $30,000 through them, bought the property, and then started working on it and borrowed another $5,000 from my dad to build our cottage and workshop, which we lived in. And then I just worked. I started work with Sailors Construction and paid it off as soon as possible. And then in 1990, we started building our larger home on the property, and that took 5 years.
Okay. So you started up building a smaller home at first, and then that led into building your next home. And actually, we talked about this about a week ago when we first got together, and you mentioned how it's changed, that where getting a mortgage on a raw piece of land is no longer the case anymore. And you felt like it was fortunate that you were able to have an opportunity to buy a raw piece of land and get the opportunity to do that where that doesn't exist now.
Well, there's a number of things that don't exist anymore. One thing was the building regulations were much more relaxed. The second thing was there was nobody in your way to tell you that you couldn't actually mill the lumber that was on your property. There's no regulations with using secondhand materials as there are today. So The cottage was built primarily from stuff that I'd pulled out of renovations, doing work that people gave me. The home I built was all milled right off the property from the logs. It's a timber frame. So you're allowed to build your own home, which you're not allowed to do anymore either, without taking some course. So I think a lot of the conditions were different, that you could take your time, build far less expensively than it takes now, and you're a lot freer to do what you wanted to do than you are now. And that makes a huge difference for a young family.
Yeah. Yeah. I definitely want to get back into that, because I think the differences between then and now is something I really like going into for historical purposes, because I hope people will be listening to this in the future. And I think it's really amazing to get to hear how things have changed. So not necessarily just in the present, but certainly in the future as well, too. People can have a bit of a concept as to how things have changed and deciding what's better or worse. You know, sometimes we just make assumptions that how things were in the past is just outdated and not as good as they are now. But I certainly like hearing stories when people talk about I think things were better back in the day.
Yeah, and I think that's probably because as you get older, you tend to miss what you knew back then. I certainly think life was a lot simpler. There wasn't as many fears or anxieties that I can recall, even as a child. We were raised in a neighborhood, and so we were free to run up and down the street without any concern of damage or injury or some other evil intent coming across us. We were free to run through the bush without people being afraid that we'd never come back. So I wasn't raised with fear in my heart, and it was never imposed on me by my parents. If we got up in the morning, my mom would give us breakfast, and out the door we went. And if we weren't home at lunch, then we were having lunch at somebody else's house down the street. Nobody worried about it. So I think when I look back and see my childhood, I realize really quite how fortunate I am, particularly when I look at the life of my grandchildren, because my boys have kids living in Vancouver, and they certainly don't have the freedoms or the carefree existence that I had when I was a kid.
Yeah, it seems as if there's a low-grade anxiety that kids have passed down to them from their parents about being nervous and questioning absolutely everything and everybody is like a super broad brush and assumption that I'm painting this situation with. But this is something that I've heard time and time again from people about, like, yeah, it was way different when I was a kid.
Yeah, and that's true here too, because even when I came to South Pender, it didn't take very long to get to know everybody. And that started to change within 10, 15 years, 20 years. I can remember the last time I was on a ferry that I ran into Earl Hastings. And he came over to me and said, "I'm glad you're on board because I don't know anybody else here." And that struck me as rather odd because Earl knew everybody. Wow. So that's, I recall that as a time when I first noticed there was a lot of people coming back and forth to Pender Island that I did not know.
Okay. So you'd say that transitioning from the early 80s into about the 2000s, things started to shift around that point where there was more people living on Pender.
Yeah, I think in part of that was because the economy was probably doing better. So more people could afford property over here. People originally, at least from my experience, would come to the island because they wanted to live here. And certainly were far more resilient and capable of living here. And I don't want to be disrespectful to newcomers or to put words in their mouths, but I think more people come here because they can afford to come here. They can afford a second home or plan for their retirement over here. But certainly the houses are getting larger. They're getting more complex. People, the new owners I find in many cases are not as resilient, are not as self-reliant in looking after their own homes, so they're always looking for someone to do it for them. And that has an effect on a small community because you start dealing with people that don't live here rather than spending your time working with people that do live here. And therefore, it's a little more difficult to knit a community together. And when those changes happen in a small community, it takes a longer time for a small community to adapt to those changes. and also the expectations of people coming from an urban center that come to a rural community. Their expectations are different. So it's not as if it's their fault. They simply are up against something they don't recognize and don't know how to adapt to or don't know their way around. And we're the same. In a rural community, we don't really know how or feel comfortable with adapting to an urban environment. So there's, I won't say conflict, but there's a bit of grading going on back and forth there. And it takes time for people to relax and get to know each other to break down those barriers, if they are barriers at all.
I super appreciate you speaking about that and putting that so eloquently, because I've never really heard anybody express it like that before, but that makes a lot of sense, what you just said there, actually, right?
Whatever I just said.
Well, no, because
no, I hear you.
I moved here briefly in 2006 and then came back to live here in 2010, bought a house, and then been here pretty much ever since. So I've only known it essentially like a little bit from the mid 2000s, but mostly from 2010 on. But for you to describe the situation that it existed from the time that you were here in the 80s till before I even got here, and how you put it so eloquently, I think that really sums up quite well as to how the island is shifting and evolving.
Yeah, I think the last survey that was done by the Trust recently showed that 54%, I think it was something like that, of people wanted the island to stay the same. But nobody really defined what that same referred to. Sure. Because what was same in 1980 and what was same in 1990 and what is the same in 2000 are completely different concepts.
Yeah, definitely. And actually, I just want, if you're able to, just give a little more clarification about what you mean specifically about how people were more resilient in terms of taking care of themselves, in terms of food or building or those things and everything else. Like, how did you see people being more resilient from the first time you moved to Pender versus now?
Well, there's, as far as food is concerned, virtually everybody had a garden. And everybody had a freezer, and everybody went fishing. There's a number of people that went hunting every year. And that food was generally moved around from doorway to doorway. If Ken went fishing, by the afternoon, people in the neighborhood had a slab of lingcod delivered to their door. If John had too many vegetables in his garden, then it was passed on to other people. But people that did come, they pretty much, if they didn't build their own home, and most of them had, then certainly they participated in it. Certainly they had some idea of how the house went together and how to maintain it, how to look after it. People needed firewood, they went out and got their firewood. So if there was, which we maybe experience this very shortly now, if there was a down power line, people knew that if it wasn't jumping all over the road sparking like crazy, then the power was dead. So we couldn't wait for a fire department because there really wasn't one. We couldn't wait for the police to block off the road because there really weren't any police here. So somebody'd show up with a chainsaw and people would just show up at the spot and move it off the road, and life would continue. So we kind of were reliant upon ourselves to deal with the day-to-day activities of getting through the day.
That's great. That's it's great to know that that's how it was, and it actually boggles my mind a little bit to hear that hydro story that you just described there. But what else are you gonna do?
Yeah, there's no point waiting for hydro, because hydro had the old Thunderbird and they were in Ganges and they had to deal with Ganges, and nobody was really interested in coming down to South Pender to serve less than 75 people. Wow.
Okay. Well, that's cool. I really like you giving some framing and some perspective as to what things were like back in the day. I'm going to come back to Pender in a little bit here, or maybe a long bit, but I want to go back into your history. You talked a little bit about being a kid growing up. Where did you grow up?
I was born in Port Alberni in 1948, not so long ago. And it was... there was two. There was Alberni, which is the town, and then Port Alberni was where the mills were. So I was kind of born with the smell of pulp mills in my nostrils. But my father was in the military back then, coming back from the war. He went back to university to get a teaching certificate. And the reason they moved to Port Alberni is because they got a bonus for living in sort of the outback. And that was pretty important, because I don't think he I think if I remember correctly, he was making $1,200 a year as a teacher. We certainly weren't well off, but we did have a little house in Alberni, and then we moved to Port Alberni to 4th Avenue. It was they were all small cottages. They weren't houses back then. They were more like cottages. They weren't very large. I have two brothers, an older and a younger brother, and so we were all packed into one bedroom. And we had a backyard. Everything was great. A little picket fence going around the joint. And everybody knew everybody. And I think that was probably because at that time, most women were housewives. They raised their family. And that, as they are wont to do, they build a sense of community in the neighborhood. So we had a wonderful community that everybody knew everybody. So with that as a backdrop, there was a sense that we could go anywhere and do whatever we wanted. So I experienced freedom of movement and freedom from care right from the get-go. And we were fortunate that at the end of our block was a large wetland, which we used to call a swamp, and went by the name of Lupsy-Cupsy. And it had a sort of a slow-moving creek that ran through it that we used to jump on these large, wide planks and pole our way around in search of muskrats, kind of like the old Tom Sawyer and who's his pal, Tom Sawyer and...
Wait, Huck Finn? Is that
Huck Finn, there you go, and Huck Finn. So we used to do that. We spent the whole days in the bush building forts or chasing, making trails and running around or sneaking up and spying on the tramps and hobos that used to camp out by the railroad tracks. So that was our entertainment. Or we'd hop on our bikes when we were old enough to ride a bike. We'd just throw on an old frying pan and a fishing rod and ride down to Alberni up to Rogers Creek and fish for rainbow trout and fry them up in the morning and camp out right there. And it was just a great life. We're just a bunch of little ruffian kids that got along with everybody. And if we didn't, then we'd have a decent rock fight and get it over with and carry on. Otherwise, it was just playtime the whole time. It was really a wonderful time.
Right on. A decent rock fight.
Yeah, well, every time, once in a while. It's sort of hard for me to even think about now, but if we got into an argument, we'd just sort of split into parties and we'd get these piles of rocks and we'd start hucking them at each other. And our aim was as bad as our distance, but if by fluke we would hit somebody and they would collapse screaming in pain or bleeding, everything would stop.
Sure.
And we'd all go, how are you doing? Are you okay? And then everybody would be pals. But it was one of our strange little growing up activities that we seem to have gone through, and everybody seemed to be okay with it.
Yeah, just blowing off some steam. And as soon as things got real, okay, time to stop this. We actually really do care about each other. We're friends here. Okay. All right. So you have super fun memories about being a kid growing up on Vancouver Island. So where did things go from being a child to being a teenager and beyond? Well,
my father got transferred to Nanaimo in 58, and I was 10 years old. So I remember the drive in the 47 Plymouth with my brothers, and all three of us were in tears for the whole trip because we just left all our best friends behind. And Nanaimo was an odd place, and it was another mill town, of course, with Harmac. A lot of bars, and it was fishermen and loggers as well. So it wasn't the type of town that was much different, but certainly the neighborhood that I moved into was different. We were newcomers then. So there was some animosities and disagreements with some of the kids that had lived there before. I've often said that Nanaimo was where I learned how to drink and fight. It was a pretty rough town. It's also because we were getting into the 50s. There was more gang sort of group activity where people would get together and they'd wear their sharp little black polished shoes and tight white jeans or tight black jeans and comb their hair in waterfalls and ducktails and stuff like that. So if you weren't part of the group, you had to stay away from that group because they would just jump you and beat you up. And so I got beat up quite a bit. I was teased because my father was a teacher there. So when I actually went into high school, I used to get punched out on a regular basis. If my father had given some kid a detention, I'd walk out of school and get plowed in the nose. And so it wasn't a particularly friendly, fond place that I recall in Nanaimo. And as soon as I could get out of grade 12, I got the hell out of Nanaimo.
Wow. So from your personal recollection, would you say Nanaimo was a slightly more violent, dangerous place than other cities in Vancouver Island at that time? Or
Well, I couldn't say. We did, Duncan, I don't think was much different. We used to have this real competition going on with Duncan, either in race cars or in fights. The Friday night special would be going down to Duncan and race cars, and then at some point a fight would break out. Ladysmith was not unlike that, other than it was much smaller. And because we were a little closer, we probably knew more kids in Ladysmith than we did in Duncan. So we had more friends in Ladysmith than Duncan. But it was certainly a time of the most important thing in your life was to get a driver's license in a car. And then the next thing to do is be to soup it up and go out to the quarter mile and race it. So that's what we did.
what was your first car?
My first car was a Caliente, a Comet Caliente.
Whoa, describe that.
Well, that pretty much describes it. It was a pretty boring car. I did step it up though to a Barracuda, the fastback Barracuda. That was pretty spiffy back then.
That sounds way cooler.
It was cooler, and I tried to get that souped up into a racing stock, but my father put his foot down and put an end to that dream.
Really?
Yeah. So a friend of mine had a Camaro. So we used to go down to Washington State or over to Mission Speedway, and we used to race that all the time, quarter mile.
Cool.
B-stock. Pretty quick car.
So you would take turns racing it, or he would race it, or?
No, I just went with him and helped him with the mechanics part of it when it broke down and haul it back. He was the driver. He owned the car, so there was just no way I was getting behind the wheel. That was not cool.
That's funny. I remember actually a friend of mine, he raced his Camaro for years, and I remember going to watch him race one time, and I got in the passenger seat after the race was over, and it was hilarious. Couldn't believe just how fast we were going, and his skill behind the wheel as well too, because when you watch from a distance, you're like, oh yeah, whatever. But it was a pretty cool experience to be in the seat of the car and be like, oh wow, you're actually really good at this.
Yeah, and 50 miles an hour was really fast back then.
It's still fast now in school zones, but so you said that as soon as you could get out of Nanaimo, you did. So I think it sounds pretty clear why you wanted to get out of Nanaimo. But what happened to get you out of Nanaimo? How did that all unfold?
Well, 62, 63, 64 were pretty important years for teenagers when the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and music erupted. There was certainly Elvis Presley, and he was bringing in some different stuff, but it didn't quite grab everybody like the Beatles did. And it's not as if the Beatles I would define as rock and roll, because a lot of their stuff was kind of pablum stuff. It was nighttime little sing-songs to put kids asleep, it seemed. Rolling Stones were something a little different. They were a little rawer, a little crisper. But what it did do was it opened a door. It simply allowed kids that were stuck in a mill town with the expectations they were going to get out of school, get a job at the mill, live in a trailer park somewhere, and drink beer on Friday, Saturday nights. When they came out, it was just a different sound, a different dress, different hairstyle, and all it really did was create some excitement because there was something different. There was an option. You could do something different. And that really appealed to me. So at that point, I guess in 66, I decided that I wasn't going to cut my hair anymore. And my hair was not very long at that time. It was just starting to hit the top of my ears, but that was still considered, strangely enough, long back then. And the longer it got, the more attention it attracted. And of course, that also took the form of discrimination, and you'd get beat up on the street for having long hair by some guy with a crew cut. So that sort of helped me push me to get the hell out of Dodge. Then I decided at that time, when I lost my job because of my hair length, I decided to go to Europe. And so I went over with a friend of mine, and we did some traveling around in Europe, which kind of opened my eyes even more. And then when I came back, I started hitchhiking. So I would just stick my thumb out and go wherever the ride took me. And that took me across Canada. It took me down through the U.S. to California on a number of occasions. it took me right across the United States until I bumped into the Atlantic Ocean. It took me all the way south and circumnavigated Mexico. And hitchhiking was a life. It wasn't a lifestyle. It was a life. We spent our time on the road, and it was safe. It was exciting. We met so many other people, and if you had long hair, then anybody with long hair would stop and give you a ride. And if you were going any great distance, then they would take you home and feed you and give you a place to stay. And you could stay as long as you like. So that was a big part of my life. I would work perhaps 6 months to get enough money so I could travel for 6 months. And I did that probably all the way through my 20s.
Wow, really?
Yeah.
Whoa.
A good chunk of it. I did take some time out to take a boat building apprenticeship in Vancouver. And I ran into a bunch of friends and spent a lot of time on the mud flats out in North Vancouver in the heyday of the hippie movement back then. That was good times. Met a lot of great people, and we did, because of the boat building experience, it gave me a chance to cruise up and down the British Columbia coast up to Bellecool and back a couple times. So I knew the coast, was getting to know the coast fairly well. And then through one experience or another, I ended up in San Diego for a couple of years, and then I came back to British Columbia. And from there on, I headed over to South Pender Island.
Okay, well, we're going to take our time getting to South Pender Island here because there's so many different things I want to talk about here. Well, I guess first of all is that all that hitchhiking through North America, that's super cool. I didn't know that. And so what parts of North America really enchanted you, areas where you first went to and you thought, oh, wow, this place is amazing?
Oregon and California. They were the best. It was a great lifestyle, good people. The further east you went, the more conservative they got. I know the first time I was stuck on a road in New Mexico, this large Cadillac came along with a large man driving it. And when I opened the door, I was staring down the barrel of a gun. And he just looked at me and said, "Just remember, I got the draw on you, son. Now where are you off to?" And he tucked the gun in between his legs, and I got in the car, and we had a great conversation all the way through New Mexico. And that happened on a regular basis, where they just show you the gun, let you know that they had the draw, and as long as you didn't make any fast moves, you're safe.
Wow.
And so we got that. I did spend one night under a turnpike in Dallas and woke up, got out on the highway and stuck my thumb out, and there was a turnaround. A car came around the corner and the tires are squealing. That's what caught my attention. He was leaning out the window, and I thought he was giving me the peace sign. So I gave him the peace sign back, and then heard this ricochet, and I realized the guy was shooting at me, and the bullets were hitting the concrete behind me. And there was only 2 shots, but what struck me odd was, first off, the guy was shooting at me, and the second thing was that I didn't clue in. It was so alien. I just stood there staring at him in disbelief, thinking, "What the hell is he doing? Why is he shooting at me?"
Sure. Well,
you'd thought I'd have ducked, but I didn't.
Well, having never experienced something like that before, I think it takes just a few seconds for your mind to catch up with that to really understand what's happening.
Yeah, strange. So then I went south, and my next trip took me to Brownsville, Texas, and then I crossed the border to Mexico and got a ride down to Veracruz and started around Mexico from there.
Okay. And, just to go back just a little bit further as well, too, before the hitchhiking began, because I really think this is important. I want to touch on this, is that you mentioned the word discrimination when it came to having long hair. And we talked about this last week, and I was really blown away with some of the things that you told me about what it was like to be a young person, especially a young man, growing his hair out long in the 60s, and what sort of a reaction that you would have potentially, and not just potentially, but certainly it sounded like in particular situations. And I think it's really important for people to hear this, because I was really unaware at how big of a deal it was for people to grow their hair out and what that meant and what the repercussions were. And I don't know if you want to talk about that a little bit more, but what was that like in Nanaimo to start off with?
Well, it was certainly tough in Nanaimo, which is kind of why I got out of it. But there was a group of us that lived on a commune out in Lanceville, and there was another commune out in the Neuse Bay. But the only thing, I suppose, other than the alternative lifestyle that we kind of look for, because it was anti-establishment, it was anti-authority, that whole sort of scene. But we were looking for an alternative way to live in a more free, easy, more enjoyable, less stressful, without, I think the phrase we used, we wanted to work to live and not live to work. And so we wanted to enjoy and explore life and what that meant to us more than we wanted to settle down into a career. For instance, when I was 13 in grade 8, I was called into the counselor's office at junior high, and I was asked one question: do I want to go in the university program or the general program? And when I asked them what that meant, I was told I could either be a doctor or a lawyer in the university program, or I could go in the general program and be a ditch digger. So I didn't necessarily want to be a ditch digger, but I did go into the general program and did a lot of the shops, woodworking, metalworking, and that sort of stuff, which has pretty much given me a career for the rest of my life, because I've been constructing either furniture or cabinetry or houses or boats or something I've been building all my life. So we were kind of looking for a few more opportunities than a university program or a general program. But you did run into people that completely disagreed with you. They disagreed with what we were doing. They disagreed with how we were living. They disagreed with how we looked. And for someone growing up in a white community, which is generally a very privileged group of people, of which we believe we were still a part of, we just happen to have our longer hair and a beard, that was a bit of a shock. It was an experience that I don't know if anybody ever kind of gets over, because you hear about discrimination, you hear about prejudice, but we are immune to it because we are the privileged white class. And so when it starts happening to us personally, simply for the sake of length of hair, it's a little unsettling, to say the least. And when it's followed by violence, it never leaves you. So I really appreciated the fact that there were so many people that were prepared to put up with all that to make the statement. And as Graham Nash said, I think I mentioned this to you earlier, the song Crosby, Stills and Nash said, "I almost cut my hair, but I didn't. I wanted to let my freak flag fly." And that pretty much captures it, because it was our flag. It was simply a symbol that let everybody know that if you had long hair, you had gone through all that, and you were still prepared to put up with it because you believed in the philosophy of being a hippie or having an alternative life. And I suppose it all sounds corny now, but back then it was pretty realistic, and it was obviously considered the same because millions of kids had long hair back then. And it was a good life.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing. And, just as you were talking, I was thinking about, I was just reading the book yesterday that I was telling you about, and in a section of it, the author was talking about growing up in East London and avoiding a gang of young men who were chasing him down and going to beat him up. And he just talked about hiding in a garbage can for 20 minutes and hiding amongst the banana peels and the yogurt containers, he said, for 20 minutes probably saved him a week in the hospital. And when you talked about getting beaten up, I don't want to gloss that over, because it's not something to be glossed over. I was attacked by 5 guys once. That was the only time I've ever been beaten up, and it's totally stuck with me my whole life. Mm-hmm. It sucks. It's like, what an awful, demoralizing, humiliating, crappy experience, and that I think that from what you're saying, it sounds like you endured some violence, very unjustified, numerous times in your life.
Yeah, and as the movement evolved and it became more politicalized, where people were starting to protest virtually about everything, but certainly the Vietnam War ventured pretty strongly in our minds, and started taking over the majority of the marches, along with nuclear warfare and Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. as the environmental movement grew and all that sort of stuff, the pressure from the establishment, from the authorities, became a little heavier. A lot of the drugs back then that were being used were still legal. LSD was legal up until probably in the late 60s, maybe 70s, I suppose, and had some prominent spokespersons for that, such as Timothy Leary, that everybody's heard about, Ram Dass, and a bunch of other people. So when that started getting involved, then it allowed the government and the police a target. And so they utilized that to start breaking up the movement. And one of the most successful ways that they did that was by having undercover agents. So that when you're sitting around with strangers and a joint was going around, if the guy had long hair, you could trust him. When the narcs came in undercover, you'd pass a joint, and the next day or 2 days later, you'd be arrested for trafficking. And so that started creating distrust within the movement. And so when that started happening, then the word sort of evolved and went around and said, all right, we can't beat the establishment, but what we can do is we cannot support it. So go back to the land, go live off the land. And so that homesteading movement began. And it seemed to make a lot of sense to me. And I was having some not very happy experiences in my life at the time, which was in the early, probably 1970, 71, 72, as I packed up and went up to northwest of Williams Lake, up to the Chilcotin area, and had a homesteading lease of a quarter section, 160 acres up there, which I started working at. And was fortunate enough to live with on a ranch with an old fellow named Tex Hansen, had been up there since the 30s. He went up on a freight train in the dirty 30s and had a quarter section on Clearwater Lake. And so I worked with him, and he taught me how to trap, how to hunt, how to do everything. He was probably as much of a father figure to me as my own biological father was. He was a wonderful man. But even there, I didn't dare go up to a place such as Anaheim Lake, which is 40 miles north of us, because the hippies that had got caught up there were generally grabbed by cowboys by the hair and dragged down to the corrals on horseback and scalped, or not scalped, but had their heads and their hair cut off with hunting knives.
No way.
So it was pretty brutal. And then I ran into a situation that had enough potential violence in it that I actually went down to Alexis Creek. I hitchhiked down to Alexis Creek and talked to the RCMP about it. And he agreed to me. He was a great constable. He came up and went and talked to a fellow. He was a German that was doing some trapping up there and had threatened me. So he had a talk with the German fellow, but I knew at that point that my time up there was drawing to a close. And then I got word that the Cattlemen's Association had decided that they would like my 160 acres in the Kleena Valley for grazing land. And so I lost the lease, and so I came back down to the coast.
Okay. And so just to get the timeline straight, and the hitchhiking was before that, or the hitchhiking happened after that?
Both sides.
Both sides of that?
Both sides, yeah.
Okay. All right. Thanks for sharing all that. I think there's obviously so many more stories in that, but I actually want to get into... Actually, sorry, before I change subjects abruptly, is there anything else that you want to say about that time? Because
it was all good times. I learned a lot. I really enjoyed myself.
Right on.
Yeah.
Right on. Yeah, I want to talk about building. And, you mentioned how you've been building things your whole life, from cabinets to furniture to houses. And maybe we could spend some time talking about that and your career as a builder and how that first began for you, I guess, and then how it's evolved since your time on Pender Island.
Well, the best times and memories I have of with my dad was in the shop building stuff. It was the only time we got to be by ourselves, and he would teach me different tricks about woodworking. So that was good times. And then woodworking in high school, I got a scholarship for furniture making. And then it just seemed when I was hitchhiking, if I'd run out of money, there was always somebody that needed something done, either fixing a barn, building a garage. The best opportunities in California was making redwood hot tubs or decks. So that's how I supplemented it. And then I was hanging out with some friends in San Jose when they were tearing down, I might have these mixed up, but I think it was the Imperial Valley that all the orchards were in. And then they decided to move that over to the next valley. So at that point, the bulldozers came in and took out all the orchards. And then they would start bringing subdivisions. So we got work, piecemeal work, framing houses in these subdivisions. So that's essentially when I learned and where I learned how to frame houses. So it was, in most cases, it was an economic necessity. But other times, I've just always enjoyed building. As I got older, in the last decade or so, the shine has sort of come off it because there's so many regulations and so many things that you have to do in order to build, as far as to get permission and the fees and the requirements and the codes, and everything just gets so complicated that you spend half your time sitting in an office filling out papers and forms and paying bills as you do swinging a hammer with the guys on the job site. So that's probably what more than anything encouraged me to stop work.
Okay. But before you were encouraged to stop work through all these regulations and red tape, let's say. But so when you first moved to the island, you said that, coming here as a contractor, how did that unfold for maybe the first decade, let's say through the 80s, like doing building on the island? How was that? And how did it wind up shifting and evolving maybe through the decades a little bit? If you can explain that to people, because I'm kind of fascinated by this. I don't think I've had a builder per se on the island necessarily talk about the transition of how building has evolved over the last 40 years through the island, but I'm curious to hear.
Well, my first job was with Ted Bowerman and Bill Hansen with Salish Construction. Percy Melville was also building on the island. Per Fisker was building on the island. There's a couple of other guys that were also going, but they were primarily smaller homes, scattered all over. I mean, the first time I came to Magic Lake, and the first job I had, I drove into Magic Lake, and I couldn't find where the job site was. I must have spent over half an hour driving around trying to find the damn place. And I came to the conclusion that the reason so many people live here is because they drove in here and couldn't find their way out. So, but they were really good to me. And then in 1985, I had an accident on the job site, which really impacted my back and has been with me ever since. But at that point, I had decided that I wanted to work on my own. And so I started up South Island Woodworks, which was named because I wanted to build boats. But that was pretty tough to work on boats on this island, pretty limited materials and a pretty limited client base. So I started just doing renovations. And then I think the first full house I built was with Charlie Boyd next to my property. And we built that one together, and then from then on, the phone just started ringing. There's always, I've been really lucky because I don't think there's been a day since I've been on Pender Island that I haven't been able to work. I've always said that you'll spend years building a reputation on this island and you'll lose it in a week, so you have to be really careful. And two of the best pieces of advice I got from a neighbor of mine was that show up on time, and if you can't, then phone and let people know. I've always kept that close to heart, even though I have not always followed that advice. But I would give that to any person that wants to find work on this island, is be on time and have the courtesy to call someone if you are not going to show up when you told them they would.
Just general good life advice.
It is.
Whether you're doing it for a job or
an interview.
Or an interview. Or a friend or anything. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Show up on time or let them know you're not going to be able to be there on time. But, okay, so you the first person that you built houses with, you said was Charlie Boyd, or the first house you built was with Charlie Boyd?
When I went on my own, yeah.
Okay, all right. And so you went on your own, and so as you had your own business, South Island Woodworks, did you start with smaller homes, building bigger homes, or back and forth, everything in between? How did that wind up going?
Yeah, homes were never really that big. I think the bigger homes started coming in probably around, probably in the 2000s. I don't think the homes were that big. And I don't want to insult anyone here, but I found that people don't build houses as much as almost monuments to wealth. The money that people are putting into houses, the size of the houses, that has dramatically changed. It's certainly changed our rural character of the island. It has changed the flavor of the island as far as its character, and also there's going to be an impact to the landscape as far as the views are concerned. So, yeah, I would say in house construction, that has been the biggest change and the biggest surprise to me is the amount of money that people are putting into building a house now. I think that unintentionally, the unintended consequences of that is that it does raise property values. It does raise the assessments of properties. And somewhere along the line, that is going to have a bearing on affordability of housing. It also creates opportunity for looking at housing as an investment. And that will and has already impact younger families who can't afford to buy their own home or afford to live here, because it also drives up the cost of living.
Sure. Yeah, it seems like it's a huge problem in many places throughout Canada right now. In 2019, we're doing this. And I think that just recently, I've noticed on the island in the last year in particular that there's been significant change in terms of housing prices seem to have spiked again. And affordability is difficult. Rental places are always an issue. Rent prices have gone through the roof in the last few years. And it's certainly there is an impact that's definitely taking place on the island that's taking away from people with lower incomes to live here, it seems like. Sure.
And a community needs all age groups and all income groups. And I think if we start losing younger people, younger families, then our community will suffer. Our whole sense of community will suffer. We need them. We need people. We need them in our fire departments. We need them in the ambulances. We need them in other services. And we just need their energy. We just need their vibrancy, because the older we get, the more settled in our ways, the more we don't like to change. And we need someone to kind of kick us in the ass every once in a while and say, no, let's try this. Let's get moving here. Let's pick it up.
For sure. I just want to lead into the second traditional question here, which is who's helped you on Pender Island? And the reason I asked this is because I thought this will be a good idea to ask people, because they're going to talk about themselves for an hour. So it'll be good to divert this on to someone else and name other people. But as I've done one podcast after another, I've realized, holy smokes, everybody seems to have too many people to list, right? And there's a tentativeness about singling out certain people because they don't want to miss out on any names. But I'm just curious with that disclaimer about who would you specifically mention as to people that have really helped you along the way from the time you've been here on Pender Island.
Well, if I was really smart, I'd say Chris Wakalek was the first.
What are you talking about? What's that? It's not even true.
Most of the people that helped me the most in my early years have all left the island or have died. They're the old timers. But they, the advice that they gave me, I still listen to, I still hear. Even in my role as trustee, I had advice from a wonderful old woman whose family had been on South Pender for generations. And she took me aside and told me not to forget the people that created the community that allowed us to move to and enjoy. And I've never forgotten that bit of advice. And I think that is crucial. And even in my decision-making as a trustee, I keep that in mind. Change is going to come. It's inevitable and necessary. But there is an essence to our character in this community. And that essence was created and nurtured by the people that came before us. And out of respect and out of just acknowledging their memory, I think it's incredibly important not to let that go and always keep it in mind. So that's what I try and do.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. Well, maybe for some people who've been on the island for a while, what are some of the names of people that you like to specifically mention who maybe are no longer living or no longer here as well, but some of the old school names of people that helped you?
Well, certainly Vicky Gillespie, because without her kindness, I wouldn't be here. There was Joy McCautry. There was, the Christies, Derek and Jiggs were wonderful friends to me. There was Russ Pomahak, who's still on Golden Point Road. His neighbor Ken. There was Charlie and Mary Johnson down the road that left a number of years ago. The Penders, the Henshaws, Anne, Len, John Henshaw. There's just a bunch of old guys, and I know I've left some out. Earl Hastings was a great old guy to sit back and chat to for any length of time. Yeah, there were so many of them. So many of them. The younger guys that I sort of grew up and worked with, such as Ronnie Henshaw and Brent Marsden, Kevin Marsden and Chuck Burgess have worked with me for years, well over 20 years. They're almost more my brothers than my own brothers. They know me inside out, and we've gone through every experience imaginable on a job site. So there's always been the guys that have helped me out in the sub-trades. There's always been guys that have served me well at the lumberyard, in the stores. It's a pretty remarkable community, as most small communities are, when people have a chance to live long enough together that they can grow and evolve together.
Cool. That's a long list of people right there. That's pretty amazing and impressive. And I always love hearing the answer to this question, because it seems as if everybody has so many people that they want to acknowledge. And it's really helped give a clear picture to me about how supportive this island is, that before doing this podcast, I didn't even know. Didn't even know. I think it's an amazing thing to have people put words to the kind of help that they received on the island and naming people. And thanks for naming names of a number of people that I don't know, because they're before my time. But I'm sure some people are going to be listening to this, remembering some old names and
cursing me for not mentioning them, I'm sure. And I don't mean to leave anybody out. I mean, one of the guys that I recall that had an impact on me right off the start was Don Sutherland, who was a doctor on the island. And when I went in to see him, he introduced himself as Don, not doctor. He said, "My name is Don, and I'm here to entertain you until nature takes its course." And I thought, this is a doctor I can live with. And Don unfortunately left the island, but he did go to the UN, and I'm not sure if he's still with the UN, but he was a pretty high-ranking official with the AIDS movement in the UN. So he really was a remarkable man and had a great career in the medical field.
Okay. If there's anybody else you want to mention later, feel free. I'm just going to move into a question where I'm going to ask you, what do you do in your spare time? What have you been doing in your spare time since you've been on Pender? What do you do for fun?
I travel. I still travel. My first wife and I split up 20 years ago. And at 49, when that happens, you realize that your future has suddenly collapsed, because you always relate to your future as being twinned. You're with someone. And so when that person leaves your life, then you're kind of left with a hole. And what the hell am I going to do? So my decision was that I would semi-retire, and that I would pull out the things that I wanted to do, while I still had the health and the ability to do it. One was to play hockey, because I'd never played hockey or skated. The second was to start climbing mountains. The third one I haven't done. That was to go back and relearn guitar. But I did start playing hockey when I was 55. I bought a pair of skates and a stick, and spent a lot of money on power skating and hockey skills, which didn't seem to help much. But I've been playing for 15 years with a great bunch of guys. So Tuesdays and Fridays are hockey days. And that group on Pender Island has grown exponentially over the last 10 years. And it's really quite a remarkable bunch of guys of different age groups and different skill levels. But the social aspect of that game is undeniable. I started out traveling. I went up with Ian Elliott and Marie Burgess on a hike up to Baker, which was only 10,000 feet. So it was a nice, easy hike up to the top of the hill, but at least it gave me a sense that it was a place I liked. It's an incredible environment out there. You feel quite humble and quite small. It's austere. And then from there, I went down and hiked some of the other hills and got up to 14,000 feet at Rainier and looked at some other hills, but there really isn't much bigger than that on North America. There's a lot of them around 14,000 in Colorado, but if you want to go higher, you have to leave Canada. So then I started going down to Peru, and we did a lot of hiking and a bit of climbing down there. Nothing extraordinarily challenging or technical, but enough to give you a taste. And then we from there I went to Nepal twice and hiked one up to the Annapurna Circuit and the Khumbu up around Everest Base Camp, and was looking to try and get up a little higher there, but weather patterns and stuff like that and a number of other factors just didn't fall into place. So that has ended now. My last trip, it was kind of a rough trip, and I had to come to the conclusion that it really wasn't as enjoyable as I once thought it was. And I had been so damn cold for so long after being sick, because it's never a question of if you're going to get sick. It's just a question of when and for how long when you're in some of these countries. But I just couldn't warm up. And that has affected me even today. I never felt the cold ever in my life until after that experience. And now I find that if I'm outside in the cold, it affects me much more than it used to. So that's taken the fun time out of climbing. So that's gone by the wayside. So right now, I'm fortunate to be married to Marnie, and we spend a lot of time just traveling out in warmer, more comfortable places.
Smart move.
And working in the garden. So we've basically got a great home life, and we really enjoy our property.
All right. Well, that's pretty, it's interesting when people talk about, it's like, oh yeah, I just went up 14,000 feet and that's it. But that's hard to do. It's not an easy thing. Like, you say it's not technical, but it takes a lot of energy. It takes a lot of will to get to the top. Yes, you certainly have to be prepared for it physically. It's very difficult to do that at sea level because everything changes at altitude. When you start running out of oxygen, everything changes from the ability to keep up your energy as far as your muscle strength, but also you start making stupid decisions, and that's where a lot of accidents happen. But it all depends on the route. I mean, there are mountains that you can stroll up and get to that altitude. So it's not necessarily the route. It is more fun if the route is a little more challenging. But not everybody, myself included, wants to hang off a rope on a sheer cliff for 2 days. It's just not something I'm particularly thrilled about at my age, maybe when I was younger, but not now. So I've never gone that way. I've just taken routes that are tough enough, but comfortable enough. And I always told my wife and my kids that the summit would only be one place to turn around. Not my final destination. My final destination would be the parking lot so that I'd make sure I got home. Well said. I guess it's important to go in with that mental intent as well, too, visualizing coming down safe and everything.
The only thing that gets you up a hill is determination. You really got to want to do it. If you don't have that, you're not going to make it because it's not comfortable. I think even at 14,000 feet, you can be well fed, be warm, be comfortable, and you'll still die because there's not enough oxygen, even at that altitude, for the cells to split and heal themselves. So if you get sick or you cut yourself, the body won't heal. So you will simply degrade until eventually you die. So it's not an environment where anything lives or can live because of that. But you do find a lot out about yourself. And I've always learned a great deal about myself and who I am in more dangerous situations than I have in comfortable and safe decisions. And that's part of the appeal, I think, that I find.
Yeah, I don't know if this is a question you can put words to or answer, but what have you found out about yourself specifically through those experiences?
I'm really stubborn. I am determined, but I'm not stupid in the sense that the goal has to be met if the cost of that goal is going to cause injury or harm. And you can use that not only in your own life, but even as a trustee when you're dealing with issues that confront your community. You don't want to take the community somewhere that is going to cause so much distress and anxiety that the goal is just not worthy of it. It's just not worth it. So you want to try and find a direction that you can attain a goal that may be uncomfortable, may be challenging, but you know it's not going to cause irreversible harm or bad feelings or all that sort of stuff. I mean, you're not going to avoid controversy and you're not going to avoid criticism, but you can rationalize your decision. You can move it in a direction where even if people disagree with you, they won't disagree with the fact that you've rationalized it and explained why you're going there. Mm. And I think that's an aspect of leadership that we have probably lost within the world. And I'm not saying I'm a leader by any means, but that is the kind of leadership that I look to in politicians and leaders of our country that I think we've lost. But that's a whole other subject.
Oh, no. Well,
a boring one of that.
I don't think it's boring at all. Just to clarify, you mean that in terms of giving clear definition and direction and rationalizing why it is you're coming to a certain decision? Is that what you're saying that you feel like we've lost?
Yeah, I think there's too many contradictions going on in the political realm right now. If we are going to talk about climate change emergencies, for instance, we can't do that unless we're prepared to sacrifice something. We're not going to achieve any goals in reducing CO2 if we don't start making some tough decisions with fossil fuels and how we change the way we practice our economy in order to reach those goals. You can't, every time we come up to a point where we have a choice to make, we can't always continually fall back on the status quo. We can't always go back to how we did things in the past. That, to me, is the very definition of insanity. You're trying to achieve different ends by the same effort, and it doesn't work. It can't work. So we have to look at different alternatives. And no matter how tough that is, if someone is prepared to provide the rationale for going there and why we're doing it, then I think people are prepared to make those sacrifices. But I don't think people are prepared to make those sacrifices if we keep changing our minds, because then it makes no sense to them.
Hmm. Interesting. Just to get back to something you said that I thought was quite poignant is that you said that what you learned about yourself through the experiences of hiking is that you were determined, stubborn, but also realizing that you're not going to risk and jeopardize your safety for the sake of the goal. And it's interesting because those things seem as if they're in opposition to each other, right? That being stubborn and determined it would typically not be the characteristics of somebody who would also know when to say when and be like, holy smokes, I think I'm risking my life a little too much here. And I know I need to pull back in this. And I think that just because you're determined and stubborn doesn't mean that you can't have some flexibility,
compromise,
and self-awareness, and compromise, and just the ability to know that, okay, well, you know what? Maybe this isn't working. Yeah, maybe we need to put the brakes on this. But thanks for sharing that. That's interesting. I'm still rattling that around my mind and thinking, oh, that's so great. I feel like I've learned something here from you.
Whoops.
Don't say whoops.
Careful.
Maybe to bring this around full circle, because you mentioned about sorting through some items that belonged to your parents. And I'm not actually sure about this, but are both your parents deceased?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. People's parents are part of the stories that brought them here. And I don't know if you'd like to spend some time maybe remembering your parents and talking about your parents a little bit and telling us a little bit about your mom and dad.
Well, my dad was born in Vancouver. His father died, came over to, well, actually, it's kind of an interesting story. My grandfather, I never met any of my grandfathers. My grandfather went to Norway, to a small town in Norway, and introduced to my grandmother. It was the first time that my grandmother met this man. She was introduced to him. He was an architect in Edinburgh. and she was informed that he would be her husband. The second time she saw him, they were engaged and married. And they left together, went to Edinburgh, and then came to Vancouver, where he practiced architecture. He was one of the people that designed the Lionsgate Bridge, although he did not like the line figures at the head of the bridge because he thought they were too British. And he also designed the Burrard Street Bridge. What he asked for in the Burrard Street Bridge is that it have two levels, one for trains and the other for automobiles, because he thought the automobile was going to be fairly popular. They only put on the one for the train. And it is the oldest bridge in North America that carries the amount of traffic that it does on a daily basis. So the guy obviously knew what he was doing. Unfortunately, the dirty 30s came along and he lost his shirt. So my grandmother and my father and my aunt, his sister, older sister, they were left without an income. So my aunt went to work, got out of UBC and went to work for the government in social services. And my father, at a fairly young age, packed it up and went up to Stewart Lake and went mining to send money back. And then the war hit, and so he joined the army, Scottish. And he went through the war, and during that time met a nurse in London, England, who sparked and decided to marry. So my mother and father got married in England, and after the war came to Canada, as a common story, I'm sure. So they ended up in Vancouver, living at my grandmother's, and then until the jobs confirmed itself. My mother was pregnant with my older brother on her way over, so she went into, I think she went into her stateroom on the ferry and stayed there until they hit Halifax. She was sick as a dog, she said, and then got on a train that seemed to be endless and just went on for days coming across this big, long, vast country. And she could not conceive of the distances coming from England. Anyway, so they moved to Port Alberni, and that's where I was born. My father started teaching there. So my father was, he really enjoyed the military, but along with it, he also, I think he enjoyed the respect and the prestige of being an officer, and he also enjoyed the authority. He exercised that authority in the household as well, which I really did not accept or enjoy. So we had a pretty tough time. We didn't have much of a relationship. We fought on a fairly regular basis. And in the process of that, of course, he would lose his temper and give us the whacks and all that sort of stuff, which was unfortunately common back then. But my mother was the anchor. She was the glue. She held us together. I would have loved that woman even if she wasn't my mother. She was just an incredible person. And just, she taught us common sense. My father was a very smart man. So he gave us all the smarts and my mom gave us the common sense. And what I also learned from my father was honesty, kindness, generosity, because the experiences he had in the war and going through Holland at the time of their liberation, he saw what the Germans had done to the Dutch. And that had a huge effect upon him. And so nobody was ever turned away from our door. Nobody ever was looking for food, was never turned away hungry. It was just part of his DNA after that. And then when I started traveling and moved out, particularly when I was up homesteading, my father and I started our relationship through letters, sort of healing up some of the wounds and covering some of the rugged rivers that we had been floating down. So we ended up becoming very good friends. I went over to my grandmother one day and said, I need you to talk and tell me about who this guy is that I've been living with for 25 years that I don't like very much. And she looked at me and said, I'm surprised it took you so long. I remember those very words that she said. And she sat down and told me that about my father's relationship with my grandfather and how tough that was and how my father had to give up his own life in order to take on his responsibility to look after his family And then he joined the war and had to take on the responsibility of looking after his country. And then he got a family and he gave up his life in order to fulfill his responsibility of bringing up a family. So I started to realize then that if I looked at my father, not through the eyes of the super guy called Dad, that could tie the shoes and could sing the songs and know all the words to the letters to the alphabet, etc., but just looked at him as a person, I got a different view. I got a different appreciation for him as a human. And when I saw that and realized that probably one of the things that he was angry about was that he really never had a life of his own. And I was fortunate enough that I made sure that I always had my life. But that came at some cost to him. So when I kind of got to grips with that, then I could look at him and understand that regardless of his behavior towards me, I knew that he was coming from a place of love. And once you recognize that, forgiveness is close at hand. So my father and I, fortunately, became very close at that time in our life. And we remained so until his death in his mid-90s. My mother and I have always been close. So they are just who I am today. And I was lucky. I mean, I've been lucky all my life. I mean, there's an old saying, you fall in a bucket of shit and come out smelling like a rose. That pretty much defines my life right there. I have been incredibly fortunate. And there's not too much I'd change about it.
Wow. Well, I think part of feeling like that way, it's how you interpret your life as well too. That's probably you made a choice to interpret it that way, or that's just part of your makeup to see it that way, right? Mm-hmm. But that's an incredibly wonderful, detailed, articulate, beautiful description of getting to understand your father better through really digging in and spending some time and looking a little bit deeper and putting some care and attention into a relationship with them through different periods of your life. Thank you for sharing that. That's really, really fantastic. What was your father's first name?
Gordon. Everybody knew him as Stewart, though. It was Gordon Stewart.
Gordon Stewart.
Yeah.
And
my mom was Cicely Beatrice, but everybody called her Lynn.
Cicely Beatrice.
Beatrice, yeah.
Beautiful name.
That's classic British, isn't it? Yeah. Little small town. She had 9 brothers and 3 sisters. Whoa. She had her father, of course, and then a stepdad. And I think one of her sisters moved to Toronto. And I think the rest of the family probably still live within 5 miles of where they were born, which is another typical English story. They don't move around much, whereas we do.
There's places to roam for us here. Highways to travel. Yeah. Cars to pick us up with people pulling guns on us and be like, all right, another gun. I know. I'll get in. I know you're packing. It's hilarious. But I think I'm going to start to wind this down now, but it doesn't have to be like super quick. But before we start the wind down, is there any particular aspect of your life that you think you might want to touch on or share, or something that we've missed that you feel like discussing right now?
No, I've done a number of things. I've been pretty impulsive all my life, so I really haven't had a set plan or a goal. I just sort of, if something comes along, I jump at it. There's a couple of things that I suppose I have some regret about, only adventure-wise. A good friend of mine met a fellow named George Dyson who lived in Belcarra, and his father was a nuclear physicist who was designing spacecraft, and his mother was a world-renowned mathematician. And but George decided that he was going to design kayaks or bidarkas fashioned after the Inuit. And we'd go over to Belcarra and help him build these things out of aluminum tubing and lash them together so the joints were flexible. And he would cover them with a fiberglass cloth. And he decided that he would try these out by taking them up to Alaska. And I was supposed to go on the trip, and I turned that down in order to go to California. And that's always been something that I think if I had to do over again, I probably would have gone on that trip, because that was a pretty remarkable voyage. I'm pretty unique.
Yeah. Well, so he told you about it later. He described how it went down. Like, what did you hear about it? Or
Oh yeah. My friends are rubbing it in for years.
oh, really? Rubbing it in for years.
Yeah. You really missed out on that one, Steve.
Oh no.
Yeah.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
Hilarious. Well, thanks very much for coming in.
Hey, my pleasure. My pleasure.
This has been remarkable, and it just maybe so people know as well too. Like you and I don't really know each other very well at all. We went out for
We're getting
there. But when I asked you to do this a few weeks back, you suggested we go out for a coffee. So we went for a coffee last week at the bakery and just talked for a little over an hour maybe, and it was a wonderful experience. And it's a real pleasure to get to meet you and to get to know you, and I hope we get to know each other better.
Awesome. Thanks, man.
All right. Well, to honor that interview, I decided I would come down to Gallon Point. So Gallon Point is located on the very south end of the South Island, and it is a incredibly remarkable spot. It's, to me, like nowhere else on the island, and it opens up into a wide expanse, and you can really feel the aliveness of the island here. To me, this is the most wild place on the island, and I decided to come down here because Steve mentioned it during the interview as one of the first places he came across, and I thought I'd do something that I've never done before, and that's come down here when it's dark out. So to give honor to the season that we're in right now, we're in December and there's a lot of darkness out, and I came down here and I've been here for about half an hour now, walking along the shoreline, listening to the different sounds of the waves crashing in. I hope you can hear them in the background there. And right now I'm just huddled in behind a blackberry bush, trying to shield myself from the wind a little bit here. So once again, thank you to Steve for doing that interview. And before I sign off, I just want to let people know about a new project I'm working on, which is titled My Audio Memoir. So this is a paid service that I am doing for people that would like to have a private recording of themselves or of a loved one. What I intend on doing is having pre-interviews with individuals to map out and shape the stories of their lives that they'd like to tell, and have multiple recording sessions with the individual to wind up having a final product of 1, 3, 7, 11 hours, whatever it is that you'd like to do. And it'll be edited for clarity and continuity and making the speaker sound as good as possible, and have as a keepsake for future generations to hear of your life experiences, or for you to have as a keepsake of a grandparent's or parent's life experience. If you'd like to know more about this, you can find out more by contacting me at myaudio@outlook.com. That's myaudio@outlook.com. If you send me a quick email, I can tell you some more information about that if you have any questions. That's it for that. But before I go, I'm going to say thank you to Ptarmigan for helping to sponsor this podcast. Thank you to Ben McConkey for doing the music. And thank you for listening. Until next time.